1947, the year almost 25% of the global population would associate with the independence of India from the British rule. Two new nations, India and Pakistan, two distinct leaders, Nehru and Jinnah, and amidst all this, millions of people realizing that the country they lived their whole lives in did not want them. The partition sought to show a ray of hope, but instead ate away millions of people by throwing them out of their homes, separating them from their families, and even worse, killing their spirits. But killing was not the only thing that happened. As history has proved time and time again, women were at the brunt of the impact of violence sought by men. The Indo-Pak Partition was no exception to this. In today's video, we will talk about the atrocities committed against women during the Indo-Pak Partition. The beginning. When the British were negotiating their exit from the country, a strange suggestion came up: divide the country into two on the basis of religion, Hinduism and Islam. Out came India for Hindus and Pakistan for Muslims, and with that, a realization occurred in the masses. Hindus and Sikhs living in Pakistan did not belong there, and neither did Muslims living in Pakistan. Thus, the partition resulted in an unprecedented population movement. Over 14 million people were displaced, making it the largest mass migration in modern history, not caused by war, disease, or famine. Families were forced to abandon generations-old homes, often with nothing more than the clothes they wore. And with the Sikh strategy of divide and rule, the British succeeded in mobilizing people from the two regions against one another. Troubles strike home. Zarina Parveen was one of the many people who suffered during the partition. She was only 12 when extremists started rallying against the Muslims still living on Indian soil, and when the mob struck the Muslim properties in the city, they poured petrol over the walls of the building where Parveen was sheltered, lighting it on fire. In an interview, she recounted how her mother was slaughtered in front of her eyes. She lay trapped beneath her corpse, while her 5 older siblings, aunts and uncles, were murdered. She was trapped under the bodies for 3 whole days with no escape. Not just that, the roof of the building also fell on her, further putting her life at risk. It was her sheer luck that a Sikh policeman rescued her from the rubble and managed to get her to Pakistan. Sadly for many, this was not even the beginning. Women in Punjab and Bengal were the most affected by the violence ensued by the partition. These two regions were the most stressful because of the region's division itself between the two countries. This led to a very sad state of affairs. A Hindu living in Lahore was as out of place and prone to violence as a Muslim living in Amritsar. As the British wanted, their final strike was working wonders and the country was burning. Women endured horrific public humiliation during this dark period. Disturbing reports reveal that Sikh and Hindu women were paraded naked through the streets of towns like Amritsar and Garmukteshwar. In some cases, they faced gang rapes before being brutally murdered or set ablaze. The violence was unimaginably savage. Pregnant women had their bellies ripped open and children were slaughtered before their mothers' eyes. Confronted with the imminent threat of sexual violence, many women chose to take their own lives rather than endure the shame that would befall their families. Chilling incidents were seen where women drowned themselves in wells and rivers to save themselves from sexual harassment. Tragically, some families even pressured their daughters and wives to commit suicide to escape the stigma associated with capture or rape. This brutality was not solely inflicted by armed groups. Local men also participated in these abductions, further deepening the tragedy and betrayal within communities. People were burning in their homes and in the streets, but many had managed to run to a safe place for refuge. Unfortunately for them, the danger had not yet passed. Danger on the go. As millions fled their homes in a desperate bid for safety, organized groups unleashed violence on refugee trains. Armed Pathans and Sikhs lay in wait, ambushing the vulnerable groups and abducting Hindu and Sikh women from Muslim-majority areas, and vice versa. This was not mere chaos, it was a calculated strategy. Reports reveal that Pathans systematically targeted Hindu and Sikh women, while armed Sikhs ruthlessly dragged Muslim women from their refugee groups, often executing executing any men who dared to resist. The violence was a chilling display of power meant to instill fear and assert dominance over rival communities. During this harrowing migration, women faced unimaginable horrors. The threat of sexual violence loomed large, and many were subjected to gang rapes in front of their families, an act designed not just to inflict physical pain, but to shatter the very fabric of familial honor. In towns like Amritsar, Sikh mobs paraded naked Muslim women through the streets, subjecting them to unspeakable acts before sometimes setting them ablaze. This was not an isolated incident, though. For these people, targeting women was probably the most efficient method of ethnic cleansing of the other group, be it in Pakistan or India. For the extremists, women were always the most compromisable. The mass abduction and rape of women were seen as tools for establishing control over rival groups. These acts were indeed to send a clear message: dominance could be asserted through the violation of women's bodies. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Communities were left reeling from the trauma inflicted upon their daughters, sisters, and mothers. The scars run deep. Beyond the physical injuries, there are emotional wounds that would haunt families for generations. This brutal tactic aimed not only to inflict immediate harm, but also to create an atmosphere of terror that would resonate through families and communities long after the violence had subsided. Every single act of violence was a horrendous testament to the lengths to which people would go in the name of power and control. The fear instilled by these atrocities created rifts within communities that would take decades to heal, if they ever did at all. Trials in the foreign land. Some women, after enduring weeks and months of unimaginable torment, managed to escape and return to their families, a feat that felt miraculous. Yet upon their return, they faced harsh social stigma. Many were labeled as tainted or dishonored because of their experiences, which led to their rejection from both their families and communities. This only deepened their trauma as they struggled to reintegrate into a world that clung to rigid ideas of honor and purity. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Many chose to remain silent about their suffering for fear of judgment or exclusion. This silence started a cycle of trauma that affected not just the survivors, but also their families and future generations. While the Indian government did establish a women's section within the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation to assist unattached women and children, the support offered was often insufficient. Many women found themselves without proper care or resources, grappling to rebuild their lives in a society that showed little empathy for their struggles. Additionally, numerous survivors lacked the skills or education needed for economic independence. The government launched vocational training programs designed to help these women reintegrate into society. However, the success of these initiatives varied widely. Many women ended up in precarious situations, often without the necessary support systems to truly thrive. Aftermath and conclusion. The psychological scars from the atrocities of partition stayed long after the violence had subsided. Survivors grappled with profound mental health issues, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety, as they navigated a world that largely failed to acknowledge their suffering. This lack of societal recognition deepened their feelings of isolation and despair, making it even more challenging for them to rebuild their lives. The trauma experienced by these women extended beyond their individual pain. It was passed down through their families and communities for generations. The legacy of violence fostered a culture of silence around gender-based violence, shaping societal attitudes that persist to this day. The atrocities faced by women in the aftermath of partition highlight the complex interplay between gender, violence, and societal norms. The forced recovery process often disregarded women's autonomy, while societal stigma compounded their suffering. As survivors struggled to rebuild their lives amidst isolation and trauma, the long-term psychological effects continued to resonate through generations.